Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, dear participants, colleagues, and speakers. Welcome to this second webinar organized within UNCTAD's online course on trade negotiation techniques. My name is Ebru Gökçe Desmon. I'm an economic affairs officer at UNCTAD's Trading Systems, Services, and Creative Economy branch within the Division on International Trade and Commodities. I will be moderating today's session. As some of you may know, this online course is the third of Trade Policy e-learning series. It is the continuation of the previous course we conducted on trade policy frameworks, which is now closed. Given the interest and the positive feedback we received from participants in our online courses, we plan to offer these courses in the near future again. Let me give you some information on the course participation as of today. We are in the fourth week of the online course, and we have 490 registered participants from over 70 countries, a large majority of which from developing countries. Out of 329 participants who replied to the questionnaire, we have 57% female, 42% male, and 0.6% non-binary participation. And 0.9% of participants define themselves as a person with disability. As for the professional profile, we have 77% from government or other public institutions, mostly from ministries of trade, commerce, and foreign affairs, 7.6% private sector, 1.8% civil society, 6.7% from universities, and 3.7% UN staff. As for the background of participants, we have 32% economics, 18% international relations, 14% law, 4% political science, 31% from other fields. And 24% of participants have already taken an online course provided by UNCTAD. On the progress of participants in the course, out of 491 participants, 200, which is 41%, successfully passed quiz 1, 124 passed quiz 2, and 102 passed quiz 3. And there are 5 modules and 5 quizzes in the course, so the progress is quite good and very encouraging. Please keep it up. I would like to remind you that if you complete all the 5 modules and pass all the quizzes and complete the evaluation survey, you will receive a certificate at the end of the course signed by our director, Luz Maria de la Mora, who is one of our speakers today. Please do complete the evaluation survey, which will be open after our third and last webinar, which will be held on the 19th of March. Your feedback is very important for us to improve our courses and also tailor them according to your needs. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers to you. We have Ms. Luz Maria de la Mora, Director of the Division on International Trade and Commodities at UNCTAD since last year. Prior to joining UNCTAD, Luz Maria was Vice Minister for International Trade of Mexico from 2018 to 2022. During her tenure as Vice Minister, Luz Maria led Mexico's trade and investment policy, overseeing 14 free trade agreements with 51 countries. She steered discussions at the World Trade Organization and negotiated the United States-Mexico-Canada Trade Agreement, comprehensive and progressive agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership and Pacific Alliance, among others. She also oversaw Mexico's trade negotiations, notably with the United Kingdom, the European Union, and Singapore, among others. Thank you very much, Luz Maria, for being with us today. I know your busy schedule. So our second speaker is Mr. Junior Lodge. He's the former Assistant Secretary General for Structural Economic Transformation and Trade at the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States. Actually, he was at this function until Friday last week. Mr. Lodge has worked on key trade negotiations, including on the Economic Partnership Agreement between the European Union and the African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, but also on private sector development. So, Mr. Lodge, thank you very much for accepting our invitation to this webinar. And last on my list today is our course instructor, which many of you already know, and he's our discussant for this webinar, Professor Craig van Grastek. Craig is a trade consultant and former adjunct lecturer at John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Craig has written a lot on trade policy and the WTO. He has 40 years of experience working with UNCTAD and a lot of experience in advising developing countries on trade policy issues. On the course platform, you have a more detailed bio of Craig and with links to his books if you would like to know more about him. After speakers' interventions, we will have a Q&A session where you can ask questions to speakers. You can also leave your questions in the Q&A box. That's it from me. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to my director, Luz Maria. Luz Maria, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Ebru. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a very great pleasure to be here in this workshop with you today. And it's a great honor to be sharing this floor with our dear colleague, Junior Lodge, and also Professor Van Grastek. Thank you so much for being here with us. And well, I know that we have a short period of time to cover a very ambitious issue, which is how to negotiate, how to do trade negotiations. So first of all, I think that the best way to learn about trade negotiations is practicing, doing trade negotiations. To me, that was the best school. But I also think that there are a few things that we can bring to the discussion so that you can get some context and also think about how to best acquire your negotiation tools, but most importantly, how to get to what you want to get. So I would like to, in this session that I'm going to have with you today, and I really feel very honored to be able to share my experience with you, is I guess that how can we make sure that we will secure a favorable result as in a negotiation. And also, I would like to go beyond WTO. I have experience from a country perspective in WTO rather than as a WTO officer. Like I have never worked in WTO, but I have worked as a trade negotiator from Mexico in WTO negotiations. And I would like to start by saying that I think that there are different kinds of skills and abilities depending on the negotiation firm that you are talking about, and also depending on the issue that you are talking about. Of course, I am talking from my own experience, which is trade. And we know that there are many other kinds of negotiations that take place in the world, political, disarmament, nuclear, all that. And I am sure that they have their own sets of skills on how to deal with those policy issues. So what I'm going to tell you is my experience from trade. Let me start by saying that when we talk about trade negotiations, I think it's very important to bear in mind that the dynamics of a bilateral negotiation or a regional negotiation or a multilateral negotiation are very different. So that the fact that they are very different in terms of the whole process also requires that we have different skills, and also it requires that we pay attention to different things. And I'm going to try to talk about that a little bit during this time that I have with you. When we're talking about bilateral, I think it's kind of more straightforward, and I think that members or countries that are participating in a bilateral have a little bit more control of the agenda. As we grow the membership, as we have more countries participating, and you can imagine with 166 members, it becomes more difficult. And sometimes the ambition may be lower, or the kind of results that we could get are more modest, or they take longer to accomplish. So it's important to bear that in mind, because it's not the same to have to negotiate with one member state or with one country in front of you, as opposed to knowing that you have to probably negotiate with many other countries, and probably you will try to build coalitions. The other thing that it's important to bear in mind is that you are representing the interests of your country. And even though you have the interest of your country in front of you, and you should know what is the end game, you also have a lot of pressure at home, no matter what. You may have pressures from the private sector, from other policymakers, from political parties, from politicians, from the bureaucracy. We always talk about bureaucracies, and bureaucracies are live animals. So you also have sometimes to negotiate more at home to be able to come up with a position, as opposed to the negotiation that you have in front of you. So this is just to put the context, and bear in mind that it's not the same dynamic, it's not the same skills, and maybe it's not even the same kind of work that you need to do when you're talking from a bilateral perspective, from a regional perspective, or at the multilateral level. When we are thinking about a negotiation, I always think that a negotiation, trade negotiations, and international trade agreements are basically a political decision. Why do I say this? Because it is the political decision of a country to enter into an international economic agreement, which is basically cooperation. When we do a negotiation and when we do a bargain for an international agreement, what we are doing is that we are giving something to get something in return. I am going to get market access for my products under preferential conditions. Therefore, if I am going to accomplish that, then I also need to give something. So this is a win-win situation. That's what all these negotiations are about. How can we end up in a better situation, in a condition where we are not, or we should not be in a situation in which is a zero-sum game. This is not a zero-sum game. A negotiation intends to build a win-win where the pie is supposed to grow. And I think that that's really important. So we need to prepare for the issue that we're going to be negotiating, or the agreement, or the sector, or product, whatever agreement. And preparing is extremely important. And I think that if you don't have a good preparation, then it's very hard that you're going to get your goal. So I cannot overstate the importance of being very prepared. And by being very prepared, what I mean is having the right information. And right information is not only numbers, it's not only doing projections, it's not only knowing your sector, but it's also talking to the actors that are involved or that will be affected somehow. As we know, in trade, there's always winners and losers. There's always somebody that's going to get more, or somebody that just does not want to give in because that's the way they have done things all the time. So why do things differently? No, so there's a lot about convincing, explaining, and this can only be done if you have the right information, if you are very knowledgeable about what you want to do. And you also need to identify and have very clear your priorities. What are the red lines? Where are the things that you know that you will not be able to give in? Let me offer you an example. If you are negotiating with if you're negotiating with a big country and you know that your export interest has to do with exports of shrimp, well, you may be able to give up concessions on market access to footwear because you don't produce footwear. So are you going to fight about footwear? No, you are going to fight about shrimp. So you need to be very clear that if you don't get shrimp, then the negotiation is not going to be good for you, because that will have not resulted in exactly what you wanted. But you also need to be very careful in terms of how you pose your interest, Because if you say, well, the only thing I care about is shrimp, then you lose your negotiating chips. But you yourself need to know what are your red lines, and what is the room that you have for negotiation. Negotiations are not done in one round. You need to establish your terms of reference, no? The scope, the objectives, what is going to be included, under which conditions. For example, if you're negotiating a free trade agreement, are you going to negotiate everything? What are the phase-out periods that you're going to be including? If you're going to have exceptions, if there's a percentage of exceptions that you will accept in terms of value, in terms of volume, what kind of information that you're going to be using. So there are a lot of things that need to be set very clearly from the very beginning. And I cannot tell you how important it is to have a very clear understanding from the very beginning of what is it that you are going to be negotiating and what is that you want to accomplish. If you are not clear from the very beginning what you want, you may end up with unpleasant surprises. Okay, so my next point, it's very important to understand your counterpart. We have to remember that we are people negotiating with other people. And sometimes you find that there are negotiators that are tough, that are unfriendly, or that have just, their skills are very tough. So you need to understand who you are talking to. The worst thing that you can do, and I'm sharing it from my personal experience, nothing is personal. Everything is professional. That doesn't mean that there are people that are easier to work with than others, that you tend to find that there are people that you could say, well, I really like this person. I really like their demeanor. I really like the way they work. They're very pleasant to work with. They understand, they listen, but not all the time. You're going to find all sorts of personalities, and you will also be another personality at the table. So it is really important to bear in mind that you need to develop good communication skills and good communications with your counterpart. Why? Because if you don't have a good communication, you may end up in a place where you don't want to be in the process of that negotiation. And also, when you have difficult times and difficult moments during a negotiation, you also need to be able to call for some space. Do not give yourself in terms of saying you get nervous, you get anxious, you get emotional. I think emotions need to be left at home, and you have to be very cold, very cold. I'm trying to think of the word in English, but you cannot be emotional. You have to be professional, and you have to keep in mind that you have a goal. What is your goal? Your goal is to negotiate market access, to negotiate a free trade agreement, to negotiate a text where you can see the interests of your country. So it is really important when sometimes the dialogue tends to heat up, to try to give yourself some time off. And even if you have to say, okay, right now, the information that we have is good enough for us, we will go back, we will consult. That's always a very good way of not breaking negotiations, just saying, you know what, I understand what you're telling me, I understand what you're asking from me. I will have to go back home and consult. Consult with my boss, consult with my colleagues, consult with the private sector, consult with the political parties, consult with whoever you want to consult. But that's always a way of giving you a buffer to really take your time and see whether there are options for you. Now, what I can also tell you is that there are always ways to solve things, but you have to be creative, you have to be propositive, and you have to know your issue, your subject very well to be able to be creative and probably use experiences from other negotiations. And what I can tell you is that there are also issues sometimes in which you cannot decide because there are issues that are very touchy. But you should know about that since the very beginning. You should know those are your red lines. So you should know that when it comes a time to negotiate a red line, and when I say a red line, and I go back to my example of shrimp, if you are in a negotiation and you know that you need market access on shrimp because that's one of your basic export products, and your partner says, I cannot give you access on shrimp, then you should not say, well, then there's no negotiation. You should say, my suggestion is, okay, let me go back to my boss, authorities, let me go back to the private sector and consult. No? So that way, you will bring the information that you have gathered from that negotiation table, and then you will leave this decision to a higher level. But my suggestion is try not to break a negotiation unless that is the decision that you have made, that this negotiation, you don't want it to move forward, no? Because not all negotiations can end up where they have to be, no? Now, another issue that I think it's also very important to bear in mind is that never go alone to a negotiation. Why do I say this? Because you need to be well supported by all kinds of information and arguments. You need legal experts. You need a lawyer next to you that understands what you are committing to, that understands the regulation, that understands law, and that understands the nitty-gritty of the language, no? Sometimes shall and should are not the same. Must and may are not the same. Can and could does not mean the same thing. So it's very important that you very well understand the nitty-gritty of language. And sometimes it's more difficult for people who don't speak English and a negotiation is in English. When it's not in your own language, it's perfectly acceptable that you bring interpreters with you, especially if it's a very delicate negotiation. But if you're going to hold a negotiation in which it's not in your own language, or even if it's in your own language, you still need to be very clear about what is it that you are committing to. So I highly recommend that you always have a lawyer next to you. You also need to have the experts. You may be an expert on the agricultural sector, but you may not necessarily be an expert on the steel sector. So if you're going to be negotiating different sectors in different negotiations, but you are responsible, for example, you're responsible for market access and tariff elimination. Okay, you should know which are the sectors that you need to take care of, which are the sectors of your interest, which are the sectors that are sensitive. So be sure to have next to you the technical experience and the technical knowledge and advice that you need to have in order to be able to make the best decisions. And when you don't have the information and when you don't know, it's better to say, I need time. I need time to consult. I need time to go back. I've heard your point. I'll go back, consult, and then I will come back with an answer, a solution, a proposal, or something else. But it's best not to commit when you're not sure about what you're talking about or what you are committing. And also, even if your counterpart has explained to you what that means, it's best to go and second check, because his or her approach or explanation of what she or he is saying may not be the same understanding in your country with your experts. So take your time, do your work, be very professional, go as deep as necessary, and consult with as many as you need. Now, when you're talking about multilateral negotiations, you have the possibility of building coalitions, of talking to different countries, member states, and exchanging information. So that's, at a multilateral level, you can build coalitions among member states. Even in regional negotiations, for example, let's think about CPTPP, RCEP, ASEAN, Pacific Alliance. You can always talk bilaterally with other countries to try to come up with a solution. Of course, it takes longer, but it also helps sometimes to move forward when you build coalitions or you work with groups. But it's not the same case when it's a bilateral negotiation. When it's a bilateral negotiation, your support, your alliances, your coalitions most likely are at home. But sometimes they're also in the other side. And what do I say? Why do I say that? For example, let's think that we want to export bananas to the European Union. Okay, so we may have to talk to the importers of bananas in the European Union because they may become our best allies. And they may also become the best advocates for having a negotiation. So you also need to think who is going to be buying your product, who is going to be your ally. And also, you need to identify very clearly who doesn't want you to be in their market. Maybe you have, I don't know, producers of pottery, no? Maybe pottery is a sensitive issue. So you need to assess, is pottery really something that you export? Is it a market that you need, that you want? Or is it one product that you would be willing to give up? Okay, if you're willing to give up, then you don't need to work or fight that much for it. But then you may also be thinking that, okay, if I need to know exactly what these people are saying, what are doing, and you may have to decide whether it's a good idea to talk directly to them or to try to find a third person to give you some information about what is it that they really want. Sometimes when we see producers that oppose to a negotiation, many times it's because they don't know. They don't have the information. And it's better to say no than really doing the work. So it is a work of you with your counterpart to really exchange information and really understand if the sensitivities are real sensitivities or they're just the way we do things. And now I know that I'm already close to my time. So I would like to just have a few final thoughts for you. I think that when you are doing trade negotiations and when you are participating in trade negotiations, you need to be, okay, first, very clear about what you need to accomplish. Second, have a very clear understanding of what are the scope in which you are moving. What kind of support you have at home from your boss, from your industry, from your government, from other bureaucracies. Sometimes the worst fights that we have experienced is among different bureaucracies. For example, the agricultural sector, the agricultural ministry does not want to give in, and the manufacturing sector is the one that needs the agreement. So how do you reach a balance between these two sectors and between these two different bureaucracies? So it's really very important to understand what are the red lines, what are your limits, where are the sensitivities, and what is your scope, no? When you come to the table, you need to be also very strategic, because you are not going to put all of your cards on the table from the very beginning and at the same time. You need to give yourself some kind of buffer area. You need to have a buffer zone where you know that you will be able to buy your own chips to be able to put them at the table. So you need to be clear about red lines, sensitivities, where are your cards, how you can play them, how you can use them, and most importantly, how do you get to your final goal? At the end of the day, you may want to accomplish 100 and you may accomplish 90. Is 90 better than 0? Or is 100 what you must get? Maybe 90 is better than 0 and will get you to a better place with a longer perspective. For example, just one final example, and I will finish here. When we talk about market access, normally we tend to say, no, we need to protect this sector. It's impossible. We cannot give duty-free access. Well, what if we think about a long period of, I don't know, phase out of tariffs of 15 years? No, but 15 years is too long. But you know what? Those phase out periods always come to fruition. After 15 years, there's 0 tariff. So you will have accomplished the zero that you wanted. Of course, not immediately, but after 15 years. And that may be best because at the end of the day, if you continue negotiating for 15 years, then you will have realized that if you had accepted those 50 years 50 years before, you would have been where you ended up being. So I will leave it here, Ebru, and happy to discuss with your audience later on. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Luzma, for these tips for being a good negotiator. I think it's very useful for the audience. I would now like to give the floor to Junior Lodge. Mr. Lodge, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, and really delighted to be here and join the panel, especially after listening to Maria Luz. I could nod in agreement in so many respects. But let me also just briefly state that I started my professional career working on bananas on a bilateral basis, and I concluded my multilateral trade negotiations by being in Geneva, where a new trade agreement, or at least the Geneva Agreement on the trade in bananas, was concluded. So this is a case of coming full circle. If I may just invite one of your colleagues to put up the presentation. I feel almost guilty making this presentation in this format after listening to the rather lucid presentation by Maria Luz, but I will try and draw on a number of issues that she has also raised. If we can just go to the next slide, which is an overview of the presentation. So I just want to introduce the CARIFORUM Economic Partnership Agreement with the European Union. Obviously talk a little bit about the context of the negotiations, but the substantive elements in terms of what I want to address is in terms of the last two, the CARIFORUM EPA approach, and explaining the results of these agreements. So the next slide, please. This is obviously what you'd call a regional trade agreement or an FTA, but obviously with a heavy development dimension. We are talking about a trade agreement with the European Union, which has been a long-standing trading partner. So there was always going to be what we would call a development dimension associated with this agreement. Of course, it starts with an understanding in terms of what is substantially all trade, how it is defined, etc. So in terms of the concrete results, we agreed to a liberalization of almost 90% of merchandise imports from the Caribbean perspective. We were liberalizing 86.9%. Obviously, the European Union was liberalizing 100%. Of course, this mass-wide variation, so the Dominican Republic liberalized 95% of its imports, EU imports, whereas those of the smaller Eastern Caribbean countries, they range from between 61 to 78%. There, of course, was a significant moratorium in terms of CARIFORUM tariff liberalization because, of course, one needs to bear in mind, this was the first FTA with a group of industrialized countries that the Caribbean was indeed concluding an RTA with, and therefore we were rather cautious, one could even say defensive in terms of our approach. Of course, in terms of other duties and charges, we recognize the significance of this. My own country, Jamaica, at that juncture, ODCs amounted to 16% of the trade revenue for the country. So it was rather significant, and therefore we approached this with an acute degree of sensitivity. Of course, this was an agreement based upon promoting sustainable development and poverty eradication. So we needed to reflect that in terms of how we approached all facets of the negotiations. And so in particular, in terms of agriculture, we're very, very sensitive. And I will cite a particular case in terms of how we approach these negotiations on agriculture. The final element is in terms of making sure, of course, that there was a link between what was happening not only in the RTA negotiations, but in the WTO, which was, of course, an overarching objective for the CARIFORUM region. Next slide, where I will just put an element with respect to the other facets of the negotiation. So, of course, this is a comprehensive trade agreement. One would even say a modern trade agreement. We were drifting away from the traditional Lomé-Cotonou approach, which was based solely on merchandise goods. And so we had provisions on services, on what you would call new generation issues. And of course, again, this being, let's say, WTO conform, we relied on the W120 list in terms of our liberalization schedule. And again, you can see the asymmetry between the European Union liberalization and those of CARIFORUM member states. Again, because of the significance of our region where we have traditionally exported commodities, merchandise goods to agricultural commodities to the European Union, we also, of course, recognize the importance of graduating and promoting trade in services, hence the need to secure adequate Mode 4 provisions, whether it is in terms of independent professionals or contracted service suppliers. Again, investment was a key area, and one of the novel treatments that we secured was making sure that there would be no diminution in the environmental standards in order to attract investment. And importantly, and this was a CARIFORUM initiative, making sure that our officials were not subjected to any corruption by European investors in order to secure investment. One of the most controversial elements of the agreement was what is called an MFN clause, which essentially said that whatever provision the European Union or CARIFORUM conveyed to a third party, that should be automatically given to the respective parties. And this covered both merchandise goods and services, where major trading partners was defined by a country having 1% or more of global trade. And with respect to a group of countries, this was 1.5%. As you can imagine, that was rather controversial, but nevertheless, that was secured within the realm of the agreement. The next slide, please. I'll try to go a little bit quickly because I want to go into the substance of how we did it. And of course, as I said before, this is a modern trade agreement, which is comprehensive in terms of the realm of disciplines covered. So there were provisions in terms of intellectual property. We were very, very proud actually here, where our accent was not simply on intellectual property, but rather on trade and innovation. We had provisions in terms of competition policy, public procurement, e-commerce, and personal data protection. And I want to highlight personal data protection also in terms of one of the lessons in terms of how we approach these negotiations. And of course, this being a modern agreement, we had provisions in terms of legal and institutional issues, not only in terms of dispute settlement, but obviously in terms of the institutional bodies that would constitute and monitor and review and facilitate cooperation within the agreement. If I can just ask for the next slide. It is important that in order to understand how and why how we approach these negotiations, to anchor these negotiations that took place between 2002 to 2008 within the overall context. And of course, one of the key elements was in terms of the European Union itself. Recall that the European Union was growing in membership. It was having quite a number of countries from what we'd call the Eastern Bloc, countries that historically have not had a close relationship with the ACP. There was also cap reform, which is important. And in fact, cap reform has allowed the European Union to become the major exporter of agricultural goods. EU agricultural production, or sorry, exports now is greater than the GDP of 15 CARIFORUM countries. So it is rather significant. And of course, there is also the change in terms of the ACP export performance, where what one could define it simply that we were experiencing preference erosion, but in a very, very strong way. And I will underscore that by giving you one data point, which is that merchandise exports to the European Union rose from 24.1 billion in 1996 to 37.1 billion in 2001. And nevertheless, the group's share of EU imports declined from 4.1% to 3.6%. Now, of course, this took place in a context where quite a number of industrialized countries experienced robust economic growth, and yet our share of these respective economies, in particular in Europe, was declining. Now, of course, the major factor there was China, but also the rise of ASEAN, the rise of what we basically now call G20 countries. So preference erosion was rather strong. This was not just an OECPS phenomenon. This was also the Caribbean itself, where our exports, in particular of bananas, a product that is very, very close to my heart. We, in Jamaica, this declined from, sorry, in the OECS, this declined from 274,000 tons to 99,000 tons in 2001, and from 77,000 tons in the case of Jamaica to 40,000 tons between 1992 and 2002. Sugar was a similar experience, a similar decline. And of course, this is a combination of declining trade competitiveness, preference erosion, but of course also WTO dispute litigation. So what we took from all of this experience was our trade access to the European Union, defined primarily by provisions for merchandise goods, was not sufficient. And therefore, we needed something that was more radical, and that radical complementary measure was in terms of a series of policy reforms that needed to be enacted in the Caribbean, and the extent to which the European Union would support these provisions. So the next slide, please. What was the CARIFORUM approach? And in a sense, we can single it out to 4 key elements. One, as I said before, we were experiencing declining trade preferences, principally in agricultural exports. However, and this is in a way sometimes also part of the contradiction of negotiations, which is, although we knew that we were experiencing preference erosion and a declining share of the European Union market, these industries were politically important and were significant also in terms of poverty eradication. And therefore, they needed to be protected, and therefore binding at least the current level or the then existing levels of protection was important. The second, of course, was to recognize that, as I said before, the Caribbean is a services economy. All 15 CARIFORUM states, the dominant sector is indeed services. And of course, we know that services, the importance of services is not simply in terms of its impact on trade. Services is also fundamentally important as a driver of trade competitiveness, and therefore having better access to the European services market, but also having more competitively priced services, it was essential in order to move Caribbean economic development. The third element was in terms of strengthening regional integration. CARIFORUM is a bit of an anomaly in the sense that there are 3 regional integration processes that are operating almost at once. One is at the all CARIFORUM level, where the Dominican Republic and CARICOM has an FTA, or have, sorry, an FTA, which is rather let's say suboptimal in terms of its implementation. The second is CARICOM, which is indeed a customs union, but again, there are serious implementation deficits. So we have had in our revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, which governs the regional integration process at CARICOM, a number, I think it is Article 238, where we call it the built-in agenda: government procurement, trade facilitation, competition policy, and investment. And these are all at different levels of implementation. So far more needed to be done. And then, of course, the final element was in terms of recognizing our trade competitiveness agenda, and therefore the imperative of seeking and locking in European development support. And again, this is where there's a specificity about EPAs, which is that we're dealing with a long-standing trading and developing partner. So those are the basic approaches in terms of the imperatives that drove us towards EPAs. Now, if I can just ask to switch to the next slide, where we'll discuss how we approached it. And again, it comes back to what Luz Maria accentuated: the power of preparations. This was expressed by not only a deep understanding of the data. That is terribly important. As I'd indicated before, we had seen the impact of preference erosion. We had seen falling export volume. We had seen falling export prices in a number of respects. But of course, we also knew that we were, let's say, immersed in a process of globalization, where there were new trading forces on the block, and most importantly, the power of trade regulatory reforms and securing capacity in order to drive competitiveness. So that was an important element. And as I was explaining prior to the start of these negotiations, we drew considerably on a wide body of literature, including from one of the participants on this call panel, Taisuko, along with Bonapas, that looked at special and differential treatment in the context of EPA in WTO. So that was one important element that we undertook. But actually, the starting point for our preparations was looking at alternatives, because as I said before, the Caribbean had never negotiated or concluded negotiations of an FTA with a group of industrialized countries before. So this was rather novel. And if I may say frankly, this was not exactly our primary motivation. This was not actually our key preference or starting point. So what we did was to look at alternative arrangements, for example, an enhanced GSP or an all ACP EPA. And when we reviewed the literature and our own research, we realized that those were not viable options. So it was on that basis why we opted for an EPA, again, leveraging the power of research. In terms of preparations, one of the key things that we accomplished was, of course, crafting our own negotiating guidelines, and subsequently we translated those negotiating guidelines into an actual text, because again, although we were not into the business of negotiating with a group such as the European Union, we wanted to be as prepared as possible. We knew, of course, that they had considerable negotiating expertise, and we wanted to be as comfortable as possible, and therefore we had our own legal text that was ready. I will admit we hardly used it, but we were prepared. A final word, again, to chime in fully with something that Luz said, which is the power of engagement with partners. And these partners actually, they start with Mexico, for example. We had consultations with Chile, with the Gulf Cooperation Council, with Brazil, countries that were already immersed in negotiations with the European Union. So we wanted to get a sense of what the Europeans are like around the negotiating table. But I would also say that one of the most important elements of our approach to the negotiations was to have constant dialogue with our European Union counterparts outside of the formal negotiations. So I managed the negotiations on behalf of CARIFORUM. I came to Brussels, where I still live. And there was not a day that I did not speak with my counterpart from the European Union. And in fact, we subsequently, published a book on the negotiations. We're very much still in contact. But the key element was understanding what the Europeans were up to so that we can be as best prepared as possible. The next slide, please. We had what is known as the Caribbean EU plan and schedule. This was an important element in terms of allowing us to prepare for how we will treat issues and when. And again, within the context where we are a rather nascent entity at negotiating with a group of industrialized countries, this was an important contributor to how we were able to prepare for the negotiations. And in fact, I keep saying that this was the first element, the first instance where the CARIFORUM has concluded negotiations with a group of industrialized countries. But it also needs to be underscored that we were party to the FTA process. And although that set of, let's say, hemispheric negotiations rest in a state of comatose, the fact is that it was extremely instructive for us because it taught us two things. One, the power of liaising, negotiating with a rather important, if not dominant trading partner, in the FTA case, obviously, the United States. So that was important because, of course, the US has not only a long history of trade negotiations, but it has a history of being rather bellicose, of being rather ambitious. And what that engagement allowed us to do was to be exposed to, for want of a better term, the modernity of trade instruments and trade policy measures. So whether it is in terms of provisions on e-commerce, whether it is in terms of competition policy, of all new generation issues, we were able to tap into that. But the second, and perhaps even more germane to our success in these negotiations, was the power of organization. So we learned to institute what we call a college of negotiators, where we had a lead negotiator on each technical discipline and an alternate negotiator. And in our instance, what was important about that was predominantly these negotiators were technical experts. So we could draw upon significant understanding. and of course, I worked for an organization which was called the Caribbean Regional Negotiation Machinery at that time. And these were the group of negotiators that drove the negotiation process, but also engaged in terms of stakeholder engagement, which again, as Luz indicated, is essential. And of course, we cannot overlook the fact that as an entity, we benefited from a considerable pool of resources, a dedicated instrument. I'm not going to name the figure, but we had resources made available by our negotiating partner. And this allowed us to conduct the negotiations, to prepare for the negotiations, but also to conduct studies. And here I'd like to give one salient example in terms of how to approach negotiations. And again, it chimes in fully with something that Luz also mentioned, which is there was one issue which the Europeans had presented. They had presented actually text on something called personal data protection. Now, most of us were aware of data protection, but only in the narrow trip sense, of course, the treatment of generic, of testing of the generic drugs. So we were unaware. And what our negotiator did was to stop the clock, conduct a technical study where we could understand the importance of personal data protection, especially given, let's say, these new thrusts that we wanted, which is to expand our trade in tourism, use digital economy and e-commerce platforms as a way of mitigating the lack of trade competitiveness that small countries, small economies have. So we instantly understood it, to the point where 3 negotiating sessions later, the negotiations on personal data protection were concluded. So this is not simply about, this is for us an example of understanding your negotiating partner, because, for example, there we knew that the European Union has always had provisions on personal data protection in all of its trade agreements. That was one. But the most important message for us was being nimble, flexible, but most importantly, competent and confident. In other words, we were not dismissive of the Europeans simply because they presented something which we were unfamiliar with. We listened carefully. We had, by that time, developed a very good track record and sound rapport with our negotiating partners. So when we suggested stopping the clock, we knew that, let's say, there was very little damage, there was very little risk in terms of the atmosphere in the negotiations. And so this was a classic case where we could leverage the resources that we had, the competence that we had developed, and also the rapport that was engendered in order to move the process forward. Sorry, the next slide, please. I just wanted to conclude on this because sometimes one needs also a bit of luck in trade negotiations. And so one of the elements that we drew upon was simply the fact that we knew that the European Union desperately wanted success. You recall, in 2008, the European Union were already negotiating with Mercosur. They were negotiating with the then Andean Pact. They were negotiating with ASEAN. They were negotiating with the GCC. And none of these negotiations at that juncture had come to fruition. So we knew that. We also knew that the European Union wanted a success of these negotiations with the Caribbean in order to demonstrate to the other ACP regions, look what the Caribbean has done. Let's go and replicate that. So we knew that, and we sought to leverage that. And one of the ways that we leveraged this was in terms of securing better provisions on entertainment services than was previously offered. So that is one key point. The second is about personalities. So I mentioned before about the working relationship that we have had with our European Union counterparts and how that has been expressed. And so one area of this was in terms of being able to secure the support that was garnered, and that was again came as a result of the relationship that we had amassed. The second example, perhaps rather personal, because there's also a very, very good friend of mine who is also now sitting in Geneva, was that, of course, the most challenging, both from a technical and political standpoint, of the negotiations was indeed the market access schedule, because I had said before, CARIFORM as a construct, there are two customs union and another entity, the Dominican Republic, which had granted concessions to the United States under CAFTA. And there, the European Union said explicitly, we want the same, all right, what is called CAFTA parity. So it was very, very difficult to engender a common market access schedule goods. However, we had an expert who did not come from the Caribbean, but had a personality which was, let's just say, rather favorable, that allowed him to be seen as a serious, trustworthy partner. And there we got the concrete results. I mentioned before about personal data protection and the power of our very competent negotiator, Patrice Pratt Harris from Jamaica. But the final point is this, which is timing is also important. So the negotiations were concluded on the 15th of December 2007. A week prior to that, the CARIFORM heads of government met in Georgetown, Guyana. And you might recall that at that juncture, there was a huge concern about food prices. So there was this meeting of the heads of governments of the Caribbean called specifically to address this issue. However, because we were unable to advance our market access schedule, we needed political clearance. And so this issue of EPAs was added to the agenda of the Georgetown summit. And at that meeting, it was very, very clear that the political fixation was on food prices. And therefore, when it came to EPAs, they were basically bent on, let's say, having it out of the way. So I wouldn't say that they quickly contemplated, but they had a robust exchange, the heads, that is, on the CARIFORM market access schedule, and concluded in order to get to the substance of the meeting, which is on food prices. So while we might extol the virtues of our professional organization, our preparation, and of our competence and the relationship that we had amassed, luck and political timing is also important. I think I will end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Junior. These are very interesting tips you are giving to participants and lessons learned from your experience. Now I'd like to give the floor to Craig. Craig has some questions to our speakers. So Craig, let's hear from you the questions, and then Lusma, if you are still available for a couple of minutes, yeah, we would appreciate. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you, and thanks to both of the speakers. I'm not sure if everyone realizes what a very difficult task I've been given, because if you're familiar with the game of baseball, you know that there's something called the cleanup batter. You have a few batters come before, and then the cleanup batter is supposed to bring those people home because hopefully they've made it on base. It's very hard to be the cleanup batter when there's 2 home runs that came before you. So I want to thank both of you for not only covering quite comprehensively and very well a number of the points that I would hope we would bring out in the discussion, but time after time, as you were speaking, I'd hear you say something and I'd write down the question where I would then follow up and say, but could you say more about this? And then you did. So it's very hard for me to pose questions to elicit much more points because you were so very good in that respect. But let me do two things. Let me pose one general question for both of you, and then bring out a few individual questions that did arise where I do think you addressed it, but perhaps I could tease out a little bit extra from you. First, let me, as a general point, say thank you for emphasizing the importance of preparations. If there was only one thing that I wanted people to get out of this course, it would be the absolute importance of preparing in advance for our negotiations. Very easy to explain that, very hard to do. And I thought both speakers helped to tease out that point very well. But here's the general question I'd like to pose to you, because when I'm asked to define my own role, I say primarily I'm an historian. And for instance, when I wrote the WTO history, I had the pleasure of speaking to a number of WTO negotiators, and I would ask them the question, what makes a good negotiator? And what's the most important thing for you to do? And I've asked this of negotiators, but I've also queried it to negotiations theory specialists, and then also people in the related field of game theory. And I get three different answers. And I was wondering if either or both of you could address the question of how nice should you be at the start of a negotiation? That is to say, how should you conceive of your relationship with a negotiating partner? And the very word partner is important, because are you dealing with a partner or are you dealing with an adversary? Or as Junior said at one point, dealing with one country that is very bellicose. So do you enter into the negotiation in the expectation that it will be a win-win outcome, as Luz Maria suggested? Or do you expect that the partner will have a different view on this? So three views here. My favorite negotiator who I dealt with in the past was Ambassador Tron. Ambassador Tron represented the European Union in the final years of the GATT, in the early years of the WTO. And when I was interviewing Ambassador Tron for my WTO history and asked him the question, what's the most important thing in being a negotiator? He said, look out for the interests of your partner. That is to say, he took a very forward position on the issue of being nice. That is, you're trying to reach that win-win solution, which to me sounded like a very good thing. And yet, I get a very different message when I talk to people in negotiations theory. And they will tell me, for example, they've studied examinations of who does well in any type of negotiation. And typically, you do better if you anchor at an extreme position. That is to say, when you first come in, if you're the seller, you want the price to be very high. If you're the buyer, you want the price to be very low. You don't show up with the compromise position that split the difference between the two. You show up with a fairly extreme position. That's quite different from what Ambassador Tron said. But then the people in game theory have a very different view. There's something called the tit for tat game. Tit for tat, where you're either cooperating or defecting with the other party. And people who have examined this, both in playing games and in simulating through computers, have discovered that it depends on what the other partner is going to be doing, but typically you do better by starting out nice. You do better by beginning from a position of cooperation, but you have to be prepared, if necessary, to respond in kind to a partner who is, as Junior says, bellicose. So there's three different views. Start nice, anchor at a very distant position, or start nice, but be prepared not to be nice. If the speakers could address that question in general, what they found has worked, And does it depend on the specific nature of your negotiating partner? And what does this have to do, by the way, with the whole preparation process? Do you learn in advance whether you're dealing with a nice or a not nice negotiating partner? I believe Junior addressed that in part, but let's get back to that point. Then a few more specific questions that arose. I thought it was a very important point that Luz Maria made about the best way to become a negotiator is to negotiate. You learn through practice. I would like to know, do you find any value in simulations? That is to say, obviously we believe in training because that's what we're doing here. And we have a variety of ways that we do this particular training program. In some of the training that I have done, for instance, when the British Brexited and they realized that they needed to reestablish a negotiating capacity, they had me come there and conduct a number of simulations. And we did learning by doing, but learning by doing without consequences. That is to say, if you made a mistake, your country didn't have to pay for it. In your own experience, have you dealt with people who have learned in that way? Has that been useful? Or in what other way can we try to prepare to be good negotiators in a relatively risk-free way? Now, Luz Maria also was speaking about the importance of communication skills, and I started to write down some questions that I thought were good, and then she answered them in advance for me. Questions like, do we have to adapt by saying different things or by doing different things? But the one question that I think may have been left unanswered is the alternative that Luz Maria was suggesting was walking. That is to say, you can either negotiate or you can walk. Are there other tactics in between negotiating and walking? Could you speak to the possibility of other ways that you might respond that don't bring the negotiations to a halt, that don't necessarily end the negotiations permanently or end the negotiations temporarily, but perhaps involve a different tactical approach to how we're going to get to yes if we do get to yes? I would like to note also, by the way, I thought it was very interesting, Luz Maria, addressing the issue of dealing with the internal issues of your negotiating partner. It just strikes me how very different the world is today than it was when I first started working in this field in the early 1980s, because most of my experience is in Latin America. And I well remember going to Latin American meetings and telling people that's what you have to do. You have to be prepared to deal internally with your partner. And at that time, the standard Latin American response is, we can't do that. That's inappropriate. It's undiplomatic. It's interventionist. But I think after a generation and a half of being much more actively involved in trade negotiations, even my Latin American friends have come to realize that this is the type of thing that you have to do. That's more of a comment on my part than a question. Now, for Junior, to me, the most interesting thing is the dynamics of negotiating when you are a regional group. It could be a regional group like the Caribbean Regional Negotiating Machinery or its successors. The CRNM is no longer with us, but you could have the Caribbean group or the ACP group. Either way, you're dealing with a group that represents multiple members. And that has its advantages and its disadvantages. So in the years that I've worked with UNCTAD and other organizations, I've had the good fortune to deal with a number of regional organizations. And I see how this does aggregate your market size. It does aggregate your negotiating capacity. It aggregates your market share, but it also has its own challenges. And those challenges involve reconciling the differing interests of your members. And I would like to pose a few questions to Junior, not in the expectation that you'll air any dirty laundry or tell us things that are confidential and should not be shared outside the group. We can always refer to country A and country B and this type of thing. But first of all, would you agree with me that dealing internally with your organization can be very challenging? And there's also the question of the smaller countries in a group, I have found almost invariably, whether I'm dealing in the Caribbean or in Latin America or in Africa or in Asia, the smaller countries are often very concerned that the group's direction is going to be dictated by the larger countries in the group. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with the differing perspectives that countries may have on the economic issues and the differing perspectives that countries may have also sometimes on the wider political issues? When Junior spoke about the context of the negotiations, realizing that we're headed into a world where more and more our trade negotiations are no longer isolated from our broader political relations with countries, to what extent has that become a difficult point of coordination? And then I'll just end on this, a final issue, because I think without referencing the term itself, Junior was really speaking to the BATNA, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement, which is one of the core concepts that we have in this course, which is if you're going to negotiate, you have to have a notion of what is your fallback position, what would you do if, indeed, referring back to what Luz Maria was suggesting about walking out, if you do walk out to what? But my question is, in a regional organization, who decides, first of all, what the BATNA should be, and secondly, when you've reached the point that you have to fall back on that second position? And here I found fascinating Junior's reference to the College of Negotiators and the collegial atmosphere. If you could elaborate just a little bit more, I understand in concept why collegiality would be extremely important. I'd like to know, and I think perhaps our participants would want to know more about how it is you achieve that collegiality. Now, I assume that that's easier to do within the Caribbean than, say, within the ACP group, simply because the more your group is cohesive, more or less homogeneous, although even within the Caribbean, we must recognize that there are very important differences in size and economic composition, in relative wealth and so forth. But if you could say a little bit more about how this collegiality is achieved, I think that would be helpful for all of us. So I'll stop there and turn the floor back.
Thank you very much, Craig, for these questions. So I want to quickly turn to Luzma. Luzma, if you can answer some of the questions Craig posed.
Well, Craig, thanks for the questions, and I would like to try to answer them very briefly. How nice you have to be. I think that at the end of the day, everything is really trying to get to the objective. If we're talking about negotiations, we are talking about cooperation, and we are thinking that we want to get to a win-win situation. So I think that from the outset, I would say, let's try to build the best relationship, because relationships count in trying to get a result. This is a win. This should be a win-win. That does not mean that along the way you will not find obstacles, that you will be probably going into a discussion or a heated discussion with your counterpart, but you have to be very careful on how you build that relationship, because if you don't have a good relationship with your counterpart, it's going to be very difficult that he or she will be willing to work with you and will be willing to help you to get to the end game. So my definition of nice may be very different from the definition of nice of the person that I have in front of me, but I do think that there are some basic elements that we have to keep in mind. And I think that respect is very important. Respect does not necessarily mean that you have to be like nice, sweet, and mellow. But respect means that you need to know how to behave yourself. And also you need to know how to communicate with the person that you have in front of you. So I cannot underestimate how important it is to be able to have those communication skills. Second, Anchor, very distant position. It depends. I really think there's not one size fits all for all negotiations. You really need to understand where you're standing. It's not the same to negotiate a product, an agreement, and it's not the same to negotiate climate change as it relates to trade or a free trade agreement with another country that is very similar in size as you are, than if you are negotiating at a multilateral level. The multilateral skills, and you were mentioning Ambassador Tron and trying to really understand the interest of the other side, may respond to a multilateral dynamic. He needed to do that to be able to build a coalition that he needed to build to be able to get to a result. And it may not be the same dynamic when we are talking about a bilateral or a regional negotiation. I cannot overestimate really that need to be well prepared in terms of substance, the technical aspect, the legal aspect, but also knowing who is your counterpart, who is somebody that will help you to move forward this. So you need to know the person, the background. You need to have this. That's why diplomacy also takes place here. You need to have a cocktail party. You need to have another kind of environment where you can have a conversation and chat and build that relationship with your counterpart. I do think there's a very important value in simulation. It's like when you get media training or when you get all sorts of training to be able to practice something that you have not done. So you should not come to the table without having done some kind of practice. And that's why I think we have a civil service and a career, because you start when you're young, you start small, you sit at the table, you learn from the negotiators that already have some experience. You learn how they deal with their counterparts. You learn how they prepare. So it's very important not to feel that because you are 30 years old, you're ready to negotiate a free trade agreement for your country by yourself. You also have to be, you're part of a team. And it's very important to learn that this is a teamwork. This is not only your work. It's your responsibility to take part of the negotiation, but this is part of a larger project. And negotiate or walk. I think that walk, when I'm saying walk out, it's just like the last resort. Of course, there are many things that you can do between a negotiation and ultimately deciding that this is not worth moving forward. So what are those things? I think that they present along the way. But you can always say, well, let me consult. Let me go back and check, as Junior very well said. Let's go back and see what you're telling, because I'm not very familiar with this issue that you're telling me about. Can you provide some more information? Can you help me better understand? Can you take me to the place where these things are happening? Can I learn more about this? Can you sit me with your experts? So I think that there are many ways there, but you have to be creative, and each situation is different. And I do see that there are two levels of negotiation, like Robert Putnam says. I really like that, the negotiation side and the ratification side. There's also always a two-edged diplomacy, no? Because you have to negotiate internally with your boss, with your private sector, with your domestic constituents, and you have to negotiate abroad. And sometimes it's more difficult, that internal negotiation, even with your colleagues in the bureaucracy, than it probably is with your counterpart abroad. So I will leave it here. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much for emphasizing again some points that you had already mentioned, like the importance of preparations, negotiations being a teamwork. Thank you, Luzma. And I would like to turn to Junior. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll try to be brief. With respect to simulation, we did two sets of simulations in the negotiations. And to a certain extent, they were very, very helpful. We had role plays. For example, I recall distinctly playing the role of the European Union. I must confess that I enjoyed that. So I could be I would refrain from using the term bellicose, but I could be assertive. Yes, I think that probably is the correct term. I could be assertive, especially relative to my Caribbean counterparts. But here is something which is often not discussed in either trade negotiation theory or even practice. There's a psychology of a negotiator. From a theoretical standpoint, all of us recognize the power of having an alternative, having red lines, and being able to say, I will walk away. But for most negotiators, there is something about their makeup, and especially when there is a task at hand, where they know, let's say, the finishing line is approaching, where there is they summon every sinew of practice, emotion to get the job done. So I underscore that because I think it is a part of the makeup of negotiators, which is often not given enough expression, which is just this, for want of a better term, a sheer belief in one's capacity to find solutions, to find landing zones, or even to win the argument relative to your partner. So not in the least discounting the power of simulations, but simply saying that that technical training also has to be anchored in, for want of a better term, the battlefield of negotiations. I'll give you another example on that, which is that I mentioned in my presentation that we prepared a negotiation text, and yet we rarely used it. And part of it is, again, being immersed in the actual business of negotiations, where by the time we had presented or were willing to present, the negotiations had already advanced. And so we thought that we were prepared, but the preparation was not timely. So that's also an important dimension. Craig posed a question in terms of the regional dimension and the complexity. And I think that obviously I spoke about EPAs, which is a bi-regional negotiation. And there's no doubt that we spent far more time on the internal consultative process than in the actual negotiation room. Because as I indicated before, this was rather novel for the Caribbean region in terms of having trade negotiations with the European Union or with a group of industrialized countries. B, this was not exactly, let's say, consistent with our ideology, our approach to trade negotiations as predominantly small, vulnerable economies. And three, we had so many different understandings of regional integration. There were different regional integration processes. So for example, one of the challenges that we had was something rather germane, which was the European Union said, whatever concession you as a CARIFORUM state, country, grants to us, you should automatically grant to each other, as in within CARIFORUM. And we have this rather bizarre situation, if I may say, of the CARICOM Secretariat claiming, no, we cannot do that. This is in contravention of our own rules. Now, again, preparations. Not only did we have a lead expert from the CARICOM Secretariat in our negotiating team, but we always carried the Bible, which is the regional integration, the treaty of the CARICOM Treaty. And if you look at, I think, Article 8 of that treaty, it is indeed a regional preference provision. It's not called that, but it's the regional preference provision. So navigating the regional dimension is very, very challenging. And that's why I think I had some data on the number of meetings that we had. I don't know if I have it here, but we had close to 100. Oh, right. No, it is here. We had 98 technical and consultative meetings, and we're just talking about internally, simply in order to arrive at a particular position. So the regional dimension was important. And again, I come back to a point that I tried to make, which is the power of personalities. So I had two bosses, larger than life figures, who were able to engage our political leadership on a constant basis. And by dint of their own leadership qualities, their communication skills, but I would argue their power of personality, they were able to convince the heads in terms of the way forward. So that is how we manage in terms of, let's say, who decide on the final position, regional position. Briefly, in terms of the College of Negotiators. So again, this is an experience that we distilled from the FTA process, where we have 4 technical negotiating groups: market access, services and investment, trade-related issues, legal and institutional. And so we had a lead negotiator for all 4 and an alternative. So there were basically 8 core negotiators. But the important element of that construct was to be able to have an overarching approach. So of course, whether it is in terms of the articulation of special and differential treatment, whether it is in terms of how we approach development cooperation, because again, there's a specificity attached to negotiating with the European Union, where this has been a long-standing development partner, whether it is in terms of how to construct a regional schedule or regional approach. Those are elements that were prosecuted within the context of the College of Negotiators, where we could have all of the negotiators there, and it's headed by our principal negotiator. So that's something that we learned. But I'll end with 2 examples which might be pertinent in terms of, let's say, challenges in negotiations. And one is from my time in Geneva. So I worked with the Caribbean, and the Caribbean, most Caribbean countries, except Haiti, are members of the Small Vulnerable Economies. But also they're part of the OECPS group. And the OECPS group benefited considerably from, the SVs, they benefited considerably from working with the G33 on a special safeguard mechanism. So again, given the importance of agriculture to our societies, we wanted to temper the trade liberalization commitments on that. And we had a proposal, and it is there anchored in the agricultural text. However, the politics of that means that you are aligned with the G33, which of course the most significant member of the G33 is China. So you're setting out your political stall. You have to deal with the political consequences of getting a backing from a major WTO member, and what are the implications for that in other spheres of the negotiations. So that's one example. The final example is this, which is also understanding your partner. So one of the elements that the European Union was always adamant about was a provision on what they call good governance on taxation, which essentially meant that countries such as ours in the Caribbean, where there are tax havens, there should be provisions in terms of cooperation on sharing information on taxation. And of course, that's something that we heavily resisted. There is indeed a provision on good governance, but it is exhortatory at best. And the reason why we could get away with this is also because the Commission, the European Commission, is a massive enterprise, which means the negotiations are led by DG Trade. Taxation is something that is led by DG Taxud. They were in the negotiating room all of the time because they were adamant about this issue. But we knew that we could convince the chief negotiator, who is from DG Trade, to say, I think this might not necessarily be the best way forward. Simply by, for want of a better term, recognizing what is the core interest of DG Trade as opposed to other facets of the Commission. So again, the importance of not just the technical preparation in terms of the data and an understanding of issues, but also knowing your partner, what is of primary importance and what you can get away with. I think I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This was a very interesting discussion, and we are beyond our time, so I think we won't have time for questions. I apologize, participants, for that, but I think we had a lot of answers to many questions. I would like to thank our speakers very much, and thank you all participants for staying with us until the end. And Lusma, we were very happy to have you during the entire webinar time. Thank you very much. We really enjoyed listening to your insights and tips. I would like to ask Craig if you have anything to add or close with.
Well, in light of the time, I think not, other than to thank everyone again for their participation.
Yes, once again, thank you all very much. It was a very interesting session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Take care. Thank you.
Yes, you too. Looking
Okay.
forward to working together on another occasion. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.